Out here, the Texas sun don't just shine, it punishes. It beats down on the baked red clay until the ground itself looks like it's bleeding. And walking right through the middle of that heat, like she was made of iron and nerve, was a girl. Couldn't have been more than 13. Her name was Ruby. She had a bruise swelling up on her cheek, a fresh one, dark and angry. Her jaw was set so tight you could hear it click. She walked with a purpose, each step kicking up a puff of red dust, leaving a trail behind her that told a story of leaving something bad and not looking back. The town she was walking away from was called Rustwood, and Rustwood wasn't a place that offered second chances. It was a town that chewed folks up and spit out the bones, especially folks who looked like Ruby. But see, fear was a luxury, a warm coat you couldn't afford when the winter was already in your bones. And after what had just happened to her back there, fear wasn't even in her vocabulary anymore. It all started over a horse, a beautiful painted horse, tied up behind the saloon. Its coat was a masterpiece of chestnut and white, its mane like black silk. Ruby had never seen an animal that fine up close. She'd only ever known work horses, tired and beaten. This one, this one was like a king. She just wanted to touch it, just for a second. So she reached her small hand through the fence, her fingers just barely brushing against its warm hide. She whispered something soft to it, a little smile finally cracking the dust on her face. And that's when the world exploded. Boots on gravel. A man's voice thick with whiskey and hate. A hand grabbed her arm, yanked her so hard she thought it had popped from the socket. They called her things I won't repeat. Vile, ugly things. One of them, a big man with a face like a rotten tomato, kicked her in the ribs. He was laughing while he did it. They told her the horse was too good for her kind, that she was nothing but dirt. Nobody stopped them. The whole town just watched. Or worse, they didn't even bother to look. They left her there in the dust, her lips split open, coughing on the memory of their laughter. But Ruby didn't cry. Tears were another luxury. She got up, slow, deliberate. She spat a glob of red onto the ground where they'd stood. A promise. Then she turned her back on Rustwood and started walking. And she walked until she reached the edge of town, where an old man was leaning against the general store. He was a relic, a piece of the old, hard West that refused to die. His face was a roadmap of forgotten trails and saloon brawls. He had a silver beard that fell down his chest, and one of his eyes was scarred shut, a milky white line where a story of violence lay buried. Folks called him Boone. He watched Ruby approach with his one good eye, and it wasn't a look of pity. It was a look of recognition, like he'd been waiting for her. Ruby saw him staring, and her back went up like a cornered cat's. "You looking at something?" she snarled, her voice a low growl. The corner of Boone's mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, but it was the closest thing that face had seen in years. "Reckon I am," he rumbled, his voice like rocks tumbling down a dry creek bed. "Ain't every day a kid walks out of town looking like she just fought a grizzly bear and won." "Don't need your help," she snapped, chin held high. "Didn't offer any," he said, pushing himself off the fence post. He started to walk past her, his spurs making a lonely, clicking sound on the dirt road. He was just going to leave her there. Another piece of Rustwood's cruelty left to bake in the sun. But then he stopped. He didn't turn all the way around, just enough to speak over his shoulder. "You like horses?" Ruby froze. Her whole body went still. After what had just happened, it was the last question she expected. "Why?" she asked, suspicion lacing every letter. Boone just nodded his head toward the hills behind the town. "Got a few that need brushing. One's got a temper meaner than a snake in a hot skillet. The other's lazier than a politician. Figured a girl who can take a kicking like you did could probably handle either one." Ruby narrowed her eyes, searching for the trick. There's always a trick. "What's the catch?" This time Boone turned to face her full on. His one good eye locked onto hers, and for the first time, Ruby saw something other than a tired old man. She saw steel. "The catch is, you work," he said, his voice flat and final. "You clean 'em, you feed 'em, and you don't steal nothing. That's the deal. You in or you out." She stared at him, this strange one-eyed man with a face like a cliffside. She tried to read him. to find the angle, the lie. But there was nothing. No pity, no charity, just a simple offer. An exchange. Work for a roof, labor for a safe place to land. For a girl who had nothing, it sounded like a kingdom. So without another word, Ruby started walking again. Not away from Rustwood this time, but toward whatever lay over that hill. She followed the quiet, clicking sound of his spurs, leaving the town and its ghosts behind her. And she had no idea she'd just walked straight into a war. Boone's ranch wasn't much to look at, just a small, weathered house and a barn that looked like it had been through a few tornadoes and decided to stay put out of sheer stubbornness. But it was clean. The air smelled of hay and leather and honest work, not whiskey and cheap perfume like the town. He handed her a curry brush and pointed to a big, thick-coated brown mare in the first stall. The horse eyed Ruby with a look that said, "Try it, I dare you." "That's Bessie," Boone grunted. "She's got a bite like a steel trap. Try not to lose a finger." Ruby just snorted. "She don't scare me." "She should," Boone muttered, leaning against a post, arms crossed over his chest, watching her. Always watching. Ruby went to work. Her strokes with the brush were firm and steady. She didn't talk. She didn't hum. She just worked, keeping one eye on the horse and the other on the old man. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the kindness to curdle, but it never did. Bessie didn't bite. After a few minutes, the mare actually seemed to lean into the brush, letting out a soft sigh. And Boone, he just watched. After an hour of solid, silent work, he finally spoke again. "So you got a name?" "Ruby." He waited. She said nothing more. "That it? Just Ruby?" She nodded. Boone gave a slow nod back. "Fair enough. I'm Boone." She knew. Everybody in a 100-mile radius knew who Boone was. The stories they told about him in town were the stuff of campfire legends. They said he'd been a bounty hunter, tracking men through deserts for a bag of gold. They said he'd been an outlaw, riding with gangs that were now just names in history books. Some even whispered he'd been on both sides of the law, playing by his own rules. But nobody knew the truth. All they knew was that he'd bought this patch of land years ago and settled into a quiet, dangerous solitude. He was a ghost from a bloodier time, and the town of Rustwood had learned to leave him be. Ruby didn't care about the stories. She just worked. Day after day, she fell into a rhythm, mucking out stalls, hauling water, fixing fences. Her hands, already calloused, grew tougher. Her arms, which had been thin, started to show the hard lines of muscle. She never complained. She never asked for anything. And Boone, he never asked questions. Not about the bruise on her cheek, which was slowly fading from purple to a sickly yellow. Not about where she came from or who she was running from. But he noticed things. He saw how she'd flinch if he came up behind her too quiet. He saw how she always positioned herself with her back to a wall. He saw how she checked the lock on the barn loft door, where he'd let her sleep on a pile of fresh hay, not once but twice before she'd turn in for the night. He saw a soldier, not a child. One morning, about a week in, she was spreading hay in Bessie's stall. Boone walked in and without a word tossed a small, heavy sack at her. She caught it out of the air, her reflexes sharp as a razor. She looked at the sack, then at him, her brow furrowed. "What's this?" "New boots," he said, his voice a low grumble. "Yours have seen better days." She looked down at her own boots. The soles were worn through in places, the laces frayed. They were the last thing her mama had given her. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "I know," was all he said before turning and walking out of the barn. That night, Ruby couldn't sleep. She lay in the loft, staring up at the dark rafters, the new leather boots sitting beside her. She thought about her mama, taken by a fever last winter. She thought about her uncle, whose fists were as heavy as his whiskey breath. She thought about the men in town, with their rotten laughter and easy cruelty. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel that cold, hard knot of anger in her stomach. It was replaced by something else, something warm and unfamiliar and confusing. The next morning, when she went to brush Bessie, she smiled, a real, genuine smile. And Bessie, the meanest horse on the ranch, nuzzled her hand. But peace, like a cool breeze in the Texas summer, never lasts long. Word gets around in a town like Rustwood. The whispers started small, then grew into a low, ugly hum. The old outlaw, Boone, had taken in a stray. A colored girl. Some folks laughed, said he was getting soft in his old age. Others spat on the ground when his name was mentioned. But nobody, not a single soul, had the guts to say it to his face. Until him. His name was Tanner Moore. 18 years old, mean as a rattlesnake, and twice as entitled. And worst of all, he was the sheriff's son, which meant he thought the whole damn town belonged to him. He saw Ruby one afternoon, leading Boone's horses back from the watering hole. He was leaning against a fence with a couple of his idiot friends, a nasty smirk on his face. "Well, look what we have here," Tanner drawled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "It's old man Boone's little pet." Ruby kept her eyes forward, her grip tightening on the lead rope. She just kept walking. Ignoring him was the best defense. But bullies don't like being ignored. Tanner stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "I'm talking to you, girl. Did the old mule teach you any manners?" Ruby stopped. She looked up at him, her face a mask of calm. Her heart was pounding against her ribs like a drum, but she wouldn't let him see it. "Let me pass," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Or what? You gonna cry to your new daddy?" He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in hard. "You don't walk away from me when I'm talking to you." "Let go," she said, the words like chips of ice. Tanner's smirk widened. He raised his other hand, ready to backhand her, to put her back in her place, to remind her what she was. He never got the chance. A gunshot cracked through the afternoon quiet. It was so loud, so sudden, it made the whole world jump. Dust kicked up in the dirt, less than an inch from Tanner Moore's boot. Tanner froze, his hands still in the air. He stumbled back, his face draining of all its color, his friends scattered like quail. Ruby looked past him, and there, standing about 30 paces away, was Boone. He had a rifle in his hands, held loose and easy, like it was a part of his arm. His one good eye was narrowed to a slit, and it was burning with a cold, silent fury that was more terrifying than any shout. "Touch her again," Boone said, and his voice wasn't a rumble anymore. It was the sound of a tombstone cracking in half. "And the next one won't miss." Tanner was shaken, a mix of fear and spoiled rage. You'd shoot me? You're crazy, you old bastard." Boone didn't even blink. He just stood there, a statue of death carved from leather and denim. Then he said the words that changed everything. The words that drew a line in the sand, not with a boot heel, but with blood and bullets. "That's my daughter." The world went silent. The wind stopped blowing. The birds stopped singing. Ruby just stared, her mind reeling. The word, daughter. It hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Boone didn't look at her. He didn't take his eye off Tanner. He just stared the boy down, the rifle a silent promise, until Tanner, mumbling and stumbling over his own feet, finally turned and practically ran back to town. That night the barn was quieter than usual. Ruby sat on the edge of the loft, her legs dangling over the side, watching the dust motes dance in the slivers of moonlight cutting through the boards. Her hands were still trembling. She heard the soft creak of the ladder and knew Boone was coming up. He sat down beside her, not too close, and handed her a tin mug. It was warm. Cocoa. They sat in silence for a long time, just listening to the horses shifting in their stalls below. Finally, Ruby spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Why'd you say that?" Boone took a slow sip from his own mug. "Because it's true." "You don't even know me," she whispered, staring out into the darkness. "I know enough," he said. Another long silence stretched between them. The kind of silence that's full of things unsaid. Then so quiet he almost missed it, she said, "I ain't never had a real pa." Boone didn't answer right away. He just looked up at the same dark rafters she was staring at. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "Ain't never had a daughter." He paused. "Not till now." And something inside of Ruby, some hard, frozen thing she'd been carrying around for years, finally broke. It wasn't a painful break. It was like a dam bursting. letting a river that had been choked for years finally run free. She didn't cry, but she leaned her head against his rough, flannel-covered shoulder, and he didn't pull away. Outside, a lone coyote howled at the moon. The horses stirred in their sleep, and somewhere deep in the rotten heart of Russwood, a fuse had just been lit. Ruby wasn't just some bruised girl anymore. She was Boone's daughter, and the whole damn town was about to find out exactly what that meant. The quiet that followed the standoff with Tanner Moore was heavier than any storm cloud. It was a waiting kind of quiet, a breath held in your lungs kind of quiet. A week passed. Boone didn't mention it again, and neither did Ruby. But the words he'd spoken, "That's my daughter," had settled in the space between them. They'd built something new, an unspoken alliance. She wasn't just a hired hand anymore. She belonged. And that meant, for the first time in her life, she had something to lose. Boone started moving differently. He'd walk the fence line every morning, his eyes scanning not just for broken posts, but for anything out of place. He spent an entire afternoon cleaning his guns, the metallic scrape and click of oiled steel echoing from the porch. He was a man expecting trouble. "You think he's coming back?" Ruby asked him one morning, watching him check the load in his revolver before holstering it. It was part of his routine now, like pulling on his boots. Boone squinted at the road leading to town. "Tanner, a pup that barks that loud usually runs when you show him a stick. I ain't worried about him." "Then what are you worried about?" He didn't answer right away. He ran a hand over his rough silver beard. "His daddy, Sheriff Moore, came by late last night, while you were sleeping." Ruby's stomach tightened. "What did he want?" "Left me a message," Boone said, his jaw flexing. "Said I was corrupting the town's peace. Said I was harboring a dangerous element." He stopped, his good eye turning to her, hard as granite. Ruby finished it for him, her voice flat. "Harboring me?" Boone just nodded once. She looked down at the toes of her new boots, the ones he'd bought her. A wave of something cold and familiar washed over her, the feeling of being a burden, of being the cause of trouble. "Maybe I should go," she said, the words tasting like ash. "This ain't your fight." He didn't get angry. He didn't argue. He just walked over and stood in front of her, forcing her to look up. "You're right," he said, his voice low and steady. "It wasn't my fight." He held her gaze. "It is now." The weight of those words, the simple, solid fact of them, pushed the air from her lungs. This feeling of someone standing between her and the world. It was so new, so foreign, it almost hurt. They fell back into their work, the unspoken tension thickening the air. Ruby oiled saddles. Boone repaired the corral gate, but they were both listening, waiting, and just before noon it came. Not a posse, not the sheriff. Something worse. A small dust cloud on the horizon resolved into two riders. They were dressed in long black duster coats, their faces hidden in the shadows of their wide-brimmed hats. They rode slow, deliberate, like they owned the ground beneath their horses' hooves. These weren't local thugs. These were professionals. Boone walked out to the middle of the yard to meet them, his rifle held loose in one hand. Ruby watched from the barn doorway, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The taller of the two riders stopped his horse a few feet from Boone. He had a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Afternoon, Boone," he said, his voice smooth as poison. "Been a long time." Boone didn't flinch. "Not long enough, Slater." So he knew them. This was old business. "The sheriff sent us," Slater said, his smile widening. "He's got a problem. Says you're stirring up a hornet's nest. Folks are getting nervous. They say you're setting a dangerous example." "The girl ain't trouble," Boone said, his grip tightening on his rifle. "The town is." The second rider, younger and with a mean-looking scar across his lip, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Doesn't matter. They want her gone, Boone. Either she walks away or we make her." Slater's smile vanished. "We both know how this ends. You can't win this fight. Not against the whole town. Not against the law." He leaned forward in his saddle. "Just give us the girl. No one else has to get hurt." For a long moment Boone was silent. Ruby's breath caught in her throat. She saw a flicker of something in his eye. Doubt, maybe. Was this it? Was this where he finally decided she wasn't worth it? Then Boone slowly raised his rifle, not to aim it, but just to rest it on his shoulder. A casual, dismissive gesture that was somehow more threatening than pointing it at their heads. "You're right about one thing, Slater," Boone said, his voice deceptively calm. "I can't fight the whole town." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But I can sure as hell fight you, and I reckon I'll start with whichever one of you is slower on the draw." Slater's eyes went cold. The friendly mask was gone. This was the real man underneath, a killer. The second rider's hand twitched toward his gun. "Don't," Boone said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "I might be old, but I can still put a bullet through that ugly face of yours before you clear leather." The tension was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then Slater let out a short, humorless laugh. He pulled back on his reins. "Always gotta be the hard way with you, doesn't it, Boone?" he said, turning his horse. "Fine. Have it your way." They turned and trotted back down the trail, disappearing into the dust they'd come from. They hadn't come to fight today. They'd come to deliver a final warning, an ultimatum. Ruby stepped out from the barn, her fists clenched so tight her knuckles were white. Who were they? "Ghosts," Boone muttered, his eyes still fixed on the empty road. "From another life." That night, the ranch felt different, smaller, caged. Boone sat at the kitchen table, the lamplight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He was sharpening a long hunting knife on a whetstone. The sound, shing, 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 was like a clock counting down to midnight. "They ain't just trying to scare you off," he said, not looking up from the blade. "They're trying to break you, make you run. They figure if you're gone, I'll go back to being the quiet old man on the hill." Ruby stood in the doorway watching him. "They don't know you very well, do they?" "No," he said. "They don't." He finally looked up, his eye locking on hers. "But they know what I used to be, and they know what I'm capable of. This ain't like those boys in town, Ruby. These men, they get paid to make problems disappear." "You gonna bend?" she asked, her voice quiet. Boone shook his head once, a small final movement. He went back to sharpening the blade, the rhythmic scraping filling the silence. "I don't bend," he said. "I break things." They didn't sleep much that night. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Every hoot of an owl sounded like a signal. The next day, Boone had to ride into town for supplies. Grain for the horses, flour, salt. Things they couldn't do without. It was the first time he was going to leave her alone since she'd arrived. Before he left, he pulled a small, silver-plated pistol from a drawer. It was smaller than his own massive revolver, easier to handle. He put it in her hand. "You know how to use one of these?" She looked at the gun, then back at him. "My uncle had one. He made me shoot at tin cans sometimes." "Good," Boone said. "Don't leave the house. Don't open the door for anyone. You hear anything, you head for the cellar, and you bolt the door. You understand?" She nodded, her hand closing around the cool, metal grip of the pistol. He looked at her for a long moment, something like worry in his eye. Then he just nodded, turned, and rode out. The ranch was eerily quiet without him. Ruby did her chores, feeding the horses, checking the water troughs, but her ears were always pricked, listening. She kept the pistol tucked into the waistband of her pants, the weight of it a constant cold reminder. Hours passed. The sun climbed high into the sky. Then she heard it, a knock on the front door. Soft, almost timid, too soft to be a threat. She froze, her hand flying to the pistol. Her heart leaped into her throat. The knock came again, a little more insistent this time. Then a voice, young, scared. "Miss Ruby, please. I ain't here to hurt you. I need to talk to you." She crept to the door, the pistol raised, her thumb on the hammer. "Who is it?" she whispered. There was a pause. "My name's Eli. I'm Tanner Moore's little brother." That stopped her cold. What in the hell would the sheriff's other son want with her? "What do you want?" she called through the thick wood of the door. I saw what my brother did," the boy's voice was shaky, "at the watering hole, and and I hear what they're saying in town. It ain't right. And you telling me this is supposed to make it better? She snapped back. No, ma'am, he said quickly. But I thought you should know. They're coming for you tonight. For real this time. My pa, he hired those men, the ones in the black coats. But Tanner, he got his own friends together. They ain't waiting. They're coming tonight to burn you out. Her blood went cold. Why are you telling me this? She asked, her mind racing. There was a long silence from the other side of the door. Because what they're doing, it ain't justice. It's just hate. And you and Boone, you're the only ones who've ever been decent to me. He paused again. Please don't tell nobody I was here. If my brother finds out. Ruby didn't answer. She heard the sound of footsteps running away, fading into the distance. She waited a full minute, then slowly, carefully, unbolted the door and peered out. He was gone. She slammed the door shut, the bolt clicking into place. Then she ran. She didn't go to the cellar like Boone had told her. She went to the barn. She threw a saddle on Bessie faster than she ever had before, her hands a blur of motion. She didn't have a plan. She just knew one thing. Boone was in town, unarmed probably, unsuspecting. Walking right into a trap, she swung herself up onto Bessie's back and dug her heels in. The horse leaped forward, stretching into a dead gallop, tearing across the open field, kicking up a cloud of dust like a thunderstorm chasing her heels. She had to get to him. She had to warn him. The whole world had narrowed down to the beat of horses' hooves and the wind screaming past her ears. Because they weren't just coming for her anymore. They were coming for him, too. And she'd be damned if she let them take the only home she'd ever known without a fight. Ruby rode Bessie like she was an extension of her own will, a four-legged fury of dust and determination. She burst onto the main street of Russwood like a cannonball, the sudden chaos sending chickens squawking and a couple of old-timers diving off the saloon porch. She spotted him instantly. Boone was just outside the general store, loading a heavy sack of feed into the back of his small wagon. His rifle was propped against the wheel, out of reach. He was exposed. "Boone!" she screamed, her voice raw from the wind. He looked up, his one good eye widening in surprise as she yanked Bessie to a skidding halt right beside him. "They're coming!" she gasped out of breath, her chest heaving. "Tanner and his friends. They're coming to the ranch tonight, to burn it down." Boone didn't ask questions. He didn't waste a single second. He saw the look in her eyes, the frantic urgency, and he knew. The fuse had reached the powder. He grabbed his rifle, tossed the last bag into the wagon, and in one fluid motion, swung himself up onto the seat beside her on Bessie. He grabbed a handful of mane. "Go!" he yelled. They thundered out of town as fast as they'd come in, leaving the stunned and staring faces of Russwood in their dust. Back at the ranch, the world shifted into a blur of frantic preparation. There was no panic, just a grim, focused energy. They were a unit now, moving with an unspoken understanding. Boone shoved his rifle into her hands. It was heavier, longer than the pistol, more serious. "You ever shot one of these before?" he asked, already moving toward the barn. "Once," she said, checking the action, the movement familiar from watching him. "Well," he called back over his shoulder, "tonight's twice." They worked against the setting sun, a two-person army fortifying their tiny kingdom. Boone dragged sharpened fence posts and scraps of barbed wire across the main path, creating a nasty surprise for anyone charging in blind. Ruby, following his shouted instructions, poured lamp oil in a wide arc in the dry grass in front of the barn, stashing a lantern and matches nearby. They filled every bucket they could find with water from the well, positioning them near the house and the barn. She didn't have to ask what the oil was for. She already knew. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bloody streaks of orange and purple, a deep silence fell over the ranch. No crickets chirped. No wind rustled the leaves. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting. And then, they came. They weren't quiet about it. They came with whoops and hollers, their shapes dark and menacing against the twilight. 6 of them, led by Tanner Moore, his face twisted in a smug, cruel grin. He held a lit torch in his hand, its flames dancing and casting monstrous shadows. They were armed with farm tools, bats, and a couple of rusty-looking shotguns. They were a mob, drunk on their own hate. Boone stepped out of the barn and stood in the wide-open doorway, his rifle held across his chest. He looked like a mountain that had decided to grow in their path. "You're trespassing," he called out, his voice calm and clear, cutting through their noise. Tanner laughed, a high, ugly sound. "This ain't your land anymore, old man. We're taking it back for the decent folk of this town." Boone didn't answer with words. He raised his rifle and fired one shot. Not at them. Into the dirt right at Tanner's feet. The message was clear. The next one won't be a warning. The mob hesitated, their drunken courage suddenly faltering. They spread out, trying to circle around. One of them broke for the house. Another started creeping around the back of the barn. From her spot in the hayloft window, Ruby watched, her own rifle pressed against her shoulder, her breath steady, her finger light on the trigger. Her world had shrunk to the space between the front sight and the back sight. Boone's voice rang out again, a final offer. "Leave now and you walk away from here. Stay and they'll be carrying you out." For a second she thought they might listen. Then Tanner, his pride stung by the warning shot, let out a furious scream. "Burn it! Burn it all to the ground!" He reared back his arm, about to hurl his torch onto the dry roof of the barn. He never got the chance. The crack of Ruby's rifle was sharp and decisive. The torch tumbled from Tanner's hand, his scream of rage turning into a shriek of pain. He staggered back, clutching his shoulder where the bullet had torn through flesh. All hell broke loose. The mob, seeing their leader go down, panicked. They started firing wildly, shot blasting into the side of the barn, bullets whizzing through the air. Boone moved with a speed that defied his age. He dropped to one knee, sighted, and fired. One of the men with a shotgun crumpled to the ground. He worked the lever on his rifle, ejected the spent cartridge, chambered a new round, sighted, and fired again. The second man went down, clean, efficient, deadly. Up in the loft, Ruby reloaded, her hands moving with a desperate, newfound purpose. The recoil of the first shot had jarred her, but she didn't let it stop her. She found another target, a man trying to light a second torch. She squeezed the trigger. She didn't miss. But one of their wild shots had found its mark. A stray bullet had grazed the edge of the barn roof, and a small flame began to lick at the dry, old wood. "Fire!" Boone yelled. Ruby cursed. She dropped her rifle, scrambled down the ladder, and grabbed two of the water buckets. The smoke was already starting to thicken. She climbed the outside ladder, her lungs burning, and doused the flames just as they were starting to spread. The remaining attackers, their numbers cut in half and their nerve completely gone, had seen enough. They grabbed their wounded, including a moaning, bleeding Tanner, and fled into the darkness, disappearing as quickly as they'd come. Silence descended again, broken only by the crackle of the dying embers on the roof and the sound of their own ragged breathing. The fire was out. The barn was still standing, and so were they. Boone walked over to where Tanner had dropped his torch. He kicked dirt over the smoldering cloth. Then he walked over to Ruby, who was sitting on the ground, the now empty rifle resting in her lap, her whole body shaking with adrenaline. He put a heavy hand on her shoulder. "You all right?" She looked up at him, her face smudged with soot, her eyes wide in the moonlight. She nodded slowly. "Yeah," she breathed. "I think I am." He looked down at her, and for the second time since she'd met him, the corner of his mouth twitched into something that was almost a smile. His voice was low and rough with pride. "You did good, girl. Real good." Ruby looked up at the vast, star-filled sky. The night was peaceful again, but she knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. "They'll be back," she whispered. Boone sighed, a long, weary sound. He looked out into the darkness where the mob had disappeared. "Let 'em come," he said, and for the first time in her entire life, Ruby wasn't afraid. She believed him. The aftermath of the attack was a landscape of scars, a blackened patch on the barn roof, new holes in the porch posts where bullets had dug in deep, dark stains in the soil that the morning dew couldn't wash away. In the days that followed, an uneasy peace settled over the ranch, but it wasn't a restful peace. It was the quiet of a coiled snake. Boone was a storm of activity. He didn't just patch the holes, he reinforced them. He replaced the damaged fence posts with thicker, taller ones. He hammered new, stronger boards over the windows of the house, creating shutters that could be barred from the inside. He was turning their home into a fortress. Ruby changed too. The fear was gone, burned away in the fire and the gunpowder. In its place was a cold, hard resolve. She spent her mornings with the rifle, practicing her aim on tin cans set up on the far fence line. In the evenings, Boone taught her how to handle the pistol, how to load it, how to clean it, how to make every shot count. She didn't flinch from the recoil anymore. She learned fast with the grim understanding that there wouldn't be time to learn slow when the real test came. This wasn't just self-defense. This was survival. She wasn't running anymore. She was standing her ground. They didn't talk much about that night. They didn't need to. The shared danger had forged a bond between them stronger than blood. But Ruby saw the way Boone was preparing, and it was for more than just another visit from Tanner and his friends. He started moving supplies, sacks of flour, barrels of water, crates of ammunition, down into the small dirt-walled cellar beneath the house. He spent an entire afternoon on a nearby ridge, sketching a rough map of the surrounding terrain, marking sight lines and escape routes. He wasn't just preparing for another fight, he was preparing for a siege. Ruby felt it too. The attack hadn't been the end of it. It was just an opening shot. The town and the sheriff had shown their hand. They hadn't just sent a warning, they'd sent a lynch mob, and it had failed. What came next would be worse. Much worse. It came 4 mornings later, a single horse galloping up the trail. It was coming too fast to be a casual visitor. By the time it reached the gate, both Boone and Ruby were on the porch, armed and ready. The rider was a boy, filthy and exhausted, barely staying in the saddle. He tumbled off his horse and stumbled toward them, gasping for breath. It was Eli, Tanner's younger brother. "They're coming," he choked out, leaning against a post to keep from falling. "The sheriff, he's bringing everyone. The whole town. He's deputized 12 men. They're saying you're a danger to the public, that you're harboring a fugitive, and that you're building a militia out here to wage war on the town." Boone's face was grim. "When?" Eli swallowed hard, his eyes wide with fear. "By sundown." Boone didn't hesitate. He grabbed the boy's shoulder. "Listen to me. You ride east. Don't follow the road. Follow the dry riverbed. About 5 miles out, there's an old abandoned line shack. You hide there. You wait. You understand?" "But I can help," Eli pleaded. "I can fight." "You already helped," Boone said, his voice firm but not unkind. "More than you know. Now ride. Go." Eli looked at Ruby, his expression lost and uncertain. She gave him a single sharp nod. "Go." He scrambled back onto his horse and disappeared over the ridge. The moment he was gone, the ranch exploded into quiet, efficient action. No wasted movements, no shouted orders. They knew what they had to do. Boone took a quick inventory of their ammunition, laying the cartridges out on the kitchen table. Ruby filled every canteen and jug with water and sealed the trapdoor to the cellar. Then she took a rifle and scrambled up to the lookout ridge Eli had just come from, her eyes scanning the valley below. The road from town was quiet. For now, by midday their fortress was ready. Boone had built a crude but effective barricade across the front gate using old rails and heavy boards, with rusted nails and broken glass pointing outward. They'd stacked crates and heavy furniture behind the windows of the house, creating makeshift gun ports. The barn, their fallback position, was stocked with water and ammunition. Ruby slid down the rocky face of the ridge and landed softly beside Boone. "Nothing yet." He nodded, his face a mask of stone. "When you see movement, you shoot. No warnings this time." She didn't argue. They ate their last meal together in the tense silence of the kitchen. Salt pork and hardtack. It tasted like dust. Boone stared at his plate, then spoke without looking up. "You could still leave, you know. Take Bessie. Follow Eli's trail. Get clear before they get here." Ruby didn't even blink. She met his gaze across the small table. "You know I'm not going anywhere." A flicker of something, pride, maybe affection, crossed his weathered face. He just nodded once. The sun began its slow descent, stretching the shadows long across the yard like dark, grasping fingers. And then they heard it, the sound they'd been waiting for. Hoofbeats, not one or two, dozens. A low, thunderous rumble that grew louder and louder. Ruby was up the ridge in seconds. She peered over the top. It wasn't just a mob this time. It was an army, at least 20 riders. At the front was Sheriff Moore, a silver star glinted on his chest, flanked by men wearing deputy badges. Behind them was a swarm of townsfolk, but these weren't the drunken fools from before. They were armed with rifles and shotguns, their faces grim and determined. They were a posse, a legal lynch mob. She scrambled back down to the house. "They're here!" Boone was already on the porch, his own rifle loaded and ready. "Get to the barn, the loft window. Don't let them get around our flank." "What about you?" "I'll greet the welcoming committee," he grunted. The riders stopped just short of the crude barricade. Sheriff Moore trotted forward. "Boone," he bellowed, his voice carrying in the still air. "I have a warrant for your arrest, and for the girl. You're to hand her over and submit to questioning for the attack on my son." Boone stepped out into the open, a solitary figure of defiance. "Your warrant's worthless out here, Moore, and the girl ain't going anywhere. Your boy got what he deserved for coming onto my land. You're harboring a known criminal and obstructing the law?" The sheriff screamed back, his face turning purple with rage. "If you resist, we are authorized to use any and all force necessary." A cold, humorless smile touched Boone's lips. "That's a funny thing about the law, Sheriff. It only seems to matter when it serves men like you. This ain't justice, and you damn well know it." The sheriff's face hardened. He'd given his warning. He raised his hand and gave a sharp, downward signal. The posse surged forward. Boone's rifle roared. The first shot didn't hit a man. It hit the sheriff's horse. The animal screamed and went down in a heap, throwing Moore to the ground. Chaos erupted. The air was instantly filled with gunfire, shouts, and the terrified whinnying of horses. From her perch in the barn loft, Ruby started firing. Her shots were calm, measured. She wasn't just firing into the crowd, she was picking targets. A man raising his rifle, another trying to light a torch. The bullets snapped through the haze, finding their marks. The posse, expecting an old man and a girl to surrender, scattered for cover, returning fire wildly. Boone moved like a ghost, using the porch columns and stacked crates for cover, firing with a brutal, methodical precision. He'd been in 100 gunfights. This was just one more. A thrown torch landed on the barn roof. Again. "Damn it!" Ruby cursed, dropping her rifle. She scrambled for the water buckets, but this time, they were ready for her. As she climbed the ladder to douse the flames, a bullet cracked past her ear, splintering the wood just inches from her head. She ducked, her heart slamming against her ribs. They were trying to pin her down, to let the fire do their work for them. Then she heard a shout from below. "They're at the back fence. They're coming around." Someone had broken through their perimeter. Boone saw them too. Two men sprinting across the yard toward the blind side of the barn. He started to run to intercept them, but he was too far away. Ruby didn't wait. She took a breath and she leaped. She launched herself off the roof, landing in a hard roll in the dirt in mud below. The pistol Boone had given her already in her hand. The first man, surprised by her sudden appearance, raised a heavy club. She shot him once, center mass. He dropped without a sound. The second man was on her in a flash. He grabbed her arm, his face a mask of rage. They wrestled in the dirt, a desperate, grunting struggle. He was bigger, stronger, but she was faster and more desperate. She jammed the barrel of the pistol up under his chin and pulled the trigger. The sound was deafeningly close. Then there was silence, a ringing, humming silence. Boone reached her a second later, his rifle ready. He grabbed her shoulder, his eye full of a fierce, desperate concern. "You hurt?" She shook her head, panting, trying to catch her breath. "No." He just nodded, his jaw tight. "Back to position. It ain't over." They fought on as night fell, the ranch lit by the muzzle flashes of their guns and the growing fire on the barn roof. The posse was pinned down, their numbers thinned, their courage shattered by the ferocity of the defense. The sheriff, back on his feet, tried to rally his men for one last, desperate charge. Boone dropped him with a single, careful shot to the leg. Not fatal, but enough. That broke them. The rest of the posse turned and fled, melting away into the darkness, carrying their wounded and leaving their dead behind. Ruby watched them go, her chest heaving, her hands black with gunpowder. Her whole body ached. Her ears were ringing, but she was standing. Boone lowered his rifle. "It's over." She looked at him, her face grim in the flickering firelight. "For now." They stood there in the quiet aftermath, two lone figures in a sea of their own making. The battle was won, but they both knew the war had just begun, and the next enemy to come down that road wouldn't be a mob or a crooked sheriff. It would be the law itself. The first snows came early that year, a cold, white shroud that covered the bullet holes and bloodstains, but couldn't bury the memory of the fight. Boone's ranch, scarred and scorched, became an island of defiance in a sea of winter white. Life settled into a new, harder rhythm, a rhythm of vigilance. Every morning Boone would walk the perimeter, check in the new traps he'd laid. Deep pits hidden under brittle branches, tripwires connected to loud, clanging bells. Every afternoon, Ruby would practice with the rifle until her shoulder ached, until she could hit a silver dollar from 100 yards away. They were no longer just a man and a girl. They were a garrison. Peace was a word they didn't use anymore. There was only the quiet between storms. The next storm arrived on a bitter, windswept morning. Boone was in the half-rebuilt barn, feeding the horses, when he saw them. A long column of riders on the distant ridge, moving slow and deliberate. This wasn't a posse. They wore blue uniforms, crisp and clean against the snow. They carried carbines and sabers. Their formation was perfect. U.S. Army. Boone didn't run. He didn't shout an alarm. He just set down the bucket of feed, his face settling into lines of grim resignation. He turned and walked to the house, his jaw clenched like a vice. Ruby met him at the door. She'd seen them too. "How many?" she asked, her voice tight. "Too many," he said, brushing past her. He walked to the center of the room, knelt down and pulled up a loose floorboard. From the dark space beneath, he lifted out a long, heavy case wrapped in oilskin. He'd shown it to her once before, when he'd first tried to warn her of what she was getting into by staying. He unwrapped it now. Inside lay a rifle unlike any she had ever seen. It was a Sharps rifle, military issue, but with custom modifications. The barrel was longer, the stock carved from a dark, polished wood, the metalwork intricate and deadly. It was the weapon of a master, a professional killer. He checked the action, loaded a single, heavy cartridge, then slung the rifle over his shoulder. "You've done this before," Ruby stated. It wasn't a question. Boone just nodded once, his one good eye dark with old memories. "Long time ago." They didn't have to wait long. The column of soldiers reached their rebuilt gate and halted. A young officer with cold gray eyes and a perfectly trimmed mustache rode forward alone, carrying a small white flag. Boone stepped onto the porch. Ruby stood right beside him, her own rifle in her hands. They stood together, a united front. "Mr. Boone," the officer called out, his voice sharp and educated. "I am Lieutenant Harrow, United States Cavalry. We are here under direct federal orders." "Funny," Boone rumbled back. "Don't remember sending for help." "This isn't a social call," Harrow replied, his voice devoid of any warmth. "A federal judge has issued a warrant. You are charged with harboring a fugitive, sedition, and armed insurrection against state law enforcement officers. You and the girl are now considered federal fugitives." Ruby's hand tightened on her rifle, but a subtle glance from Boone kept her still. "And what do you aim to do about it, Lieutenant?" Boone asked, his voice deceptively calm. "We are authorized to offer you one chance to surrender peacefully," Harrow said, his words precise and cold. "Lay down your arms and come with us. If you refuse, we are under orders to take this property by any means necessary." "I thought the Army was supposed to protect folks," Ruby called out, her voice clear and strong. Harrow's gray eyes flicked to her for the first time. There was no pity in them, only contempt. We protect the citizens who obey the law of the land. Boone let out a short, harsh laugh that held no humor. Well then, I guess that makes us outlaws. The lieutenant's face remained a mask of professional indifference. He simply nodded once, as if Boone had just confirmed an expected outcome. He turned his horse and rode back to his men. The white flag came down. Orders were barked. The column of soldiers split into two, flanking the ranch from both sides in a classic pincer movement. Boone and Ruby retreated back inside the house. "They'll burn us out," she said, her voice a low whisper as she barred the heavy door. "Then we'll bury 'em in the ashes," Boone replied, taking up a position at a window. The battle began at dusk. The soldiers were smart. They didn't charge blindly like the posse. They used the terrain, moving from cover to cover. They set fire to the outbuildings first, the ones far from the main house, trying to draw them out, to smoke them out into the open. They thought they were fighting a broken-down old man and a teenage girl. They were wrong. They were fighting a legend, and his heir. Boone's first shot came from the darkened window of the house. The big Sharp's rifle boomed, the sound echoing across the valley. 150 yards away, a sergeant who was directing his men simply dropped from his saddle. A clean shot. Impossible for most men. Routine for Boone. The soldiers dove for cover, their disciplined advance momentarily broken. They returned fire. A volley of carbine shots ripping into the walls of the house, splintering wood, shattering glass. But Boone and Ruby were already gone from the windows. Ruby moved like a ghost through the cellar, up a hidden ladder, and out a small, concealed door at the back of the house. She'd spent weeks memorizing every inch of this land, every shadow, every blind spot. She circled around through the smoke, came up behind a squad of soldiers, pinning down the house, and fired two quick, precise shots from the darkness. Then she vanished back into the smoke before they even knew where the attack had come from. Inside, Boone reloaded the big Sharps. Every shot was deliberate. Every bullet was a message. He wasn't trying to scare them. He was dismantling their command structure, one officer at a time. Lieutenant Harrow watched from the ridge, his face a thundercloud of fury. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was supposed to be a simple arrest. He pulled out his own pistol, checked the cylinder, and dismounted. He wouldn't be beaten by some backwoods relic. He signaled for a second wave, a direct assault on the main house under heavy cover fire. The pressure intensified. Bullets tore through the thin walls of the house. A round shattered the window right next to Boone's head, sending a spray of glass across the room. He grunted, stumbling back, a dark line of red appearing on his arm. "You're hit!" Ruby cried, rushing to his side as he leaned against the wall. "Just a graze," he hissed through clenched teeth. She quickly tore a strip of cloth from her shirt and tied it tight around his bicep, stanching the flow of blood. He shoved a handful of cartridges into her hand. "Hold this door. Whatever happens, don't let them take this door." "What about you?" she asked, her eyes wide with fear for him. "I'm ending it," he said. He slipped out the back, the big Sharp's rifle in his hands, and disappeared into the smoke and chaos. Harrow reached the front porch, flanked by two of his best men. He kicked the door clean off its hinges. Ruby was waiting. She fired the pistol point blank. The soldier on Harrow's left went down, a look of shock on his face. She fired again, hitting the second soldier in the neck. Harrow dove behind the overturned kitchen table as Ruby emptied the pistol, the bullets thudding into the thick wood. He returned fire, a single shot that grazed her shoulder, sending a searing pain down her arm. She cried out and dropped behind the cover of a crate. Harrow rose, pistol extended, ready to finish it. He never saw Boone. The old man came in through a side window, silent as death. The big Sharp's rifle was leveled, not at his shoulder, but at his hip. Harrow turned, his eyes widening in surprise. He was too late. Boone fired. The heavy slug from the Sharps hit Harrow square in the chest, lifting him off his feet and slamming him back against the wall. He slid to the floor, stunned, not dead, but out of the fight. The remaining soldiers outside froze. Their leader was down. Their ranks were broken. The house was a death trap. They ran. They grabbed their wounded, including their fallen lieutenant, and they retreated back into the snow-swept darkness. Boone lowered his rifle, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Ruby crawled out from behind her crate, her face pale, blood seeping through the sleeve of her shirt. "You good?" he asked, his voice rough. She nodded, gritting her teeth against the pain. Better than them. They didn't speak for a long time after that. They just sat on the floor of their ruined, smoldering home, listening to the sound of the retreating hoofbeats fade into the distance. The fire in the outbuildings smoldered out. The snow began to fall again, covering the new bodies, the new blood. The house still stood, barely. Finally, Ruby broke the silence. Her voice was quiet, weary, but strong. They'll just send more. Yeah, Boone said, leaning his head back against the bullet-riddled wall. They probably will. He looked over at her, his one good eye filled with a fierce, unwavering pride. But we'll be ready. He looked at the girl beside him. No longer just a girl. She was a warrior, forged in fire and blood. His daughter. And he looked at the Sharp's rifle resting across his knees. A relic from a past he'd tried to bury. But the past never stays buried. Out here in the heart of Texas, you either face your ghosts or they consume you. And Boone and Ruby, they were done running from ghosts. If you enjoyed this story, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You never know what other tales of justice and survival will uncover from the forgotten corners of the old Wild West. Thanks for watching.